So, you're seeing the screen right now, but how? Well, first, your eyes. Your eyes are the sensory organs with which you can see anything. Very oversimplified, how they work is light enters your eye and lands on the retina, which is at the back of the eye. The retina is made up of cones and rods at the bottom with which the light interacts with. These cones and rods then send signals to the cells in the retina, which in turn send signals along the retina to the brain. Cones are responsible for color vision and work best in daylight. The rods only see shades of grey and work best at night. There are three different types of cones: short, medium, and long cones, each called this because of the wavelength of light they can perceive. So for example, the long cone would have a red opsin and a short cone would have a blue opsin. Together, these three cone types give us the vision we have from purple to red. Opsins are proteins made for detecting light. In these opsins, they also have a molecule called retinaldehyde, or retinal. When light strikes the opsin, it changes the molecular shape of the retinal. This causes a chain which ends in the cone cells stopping sending glutamate to bipolar cells. When the opsins aren't doing anything because light isn't striking them, the cones send glutamate to bipolar cells, telling them that nothing is happening. But once light strikes these cones, they decrease the glutamate being sent to bipolar cells, and the bipolar cells detect this decrease and send a signal to the ganglion cells. The ganglion cells are neurons and send the information to three parts of the brain: the thalamus, hypothalamus, and mesencephalon, or midbrain. The thalamus is a hub of sorts, where a lot of the senses send their information to the thalamus and then further on to other parts of the brain. For example, like we were just discussing, information from the retina gets sent to the thalamus, which then gets sent to the visual cortex, which has evolved to deal with all the information that gets sent by the retina. The hypothalamus deals a lot with the nervous system and how the body responds to stimuli, such as fear, smell, and also vision. And lastly, the mesencephalon, or midbrain. The midbrain helps relay and react to information from hearing or vision. A part of the midbrain also creates dopamine and plays a part in a person's movement planning, excitation, and motivation. Also, I'm not an expert in any of this, so keep in mind this is quite oversimplified. And for the experts, please correct me if I say something wrong. Now, from the cones in the retina to the ganglion cells, two different parts of the brain, all of these come together to create an image that you're seeing right now. But how it really creates this image, where it creates it, what even consciousness is, and how you're seeing this image is still a mystery. All of this, from cell to neuron to brain part, is just electrical signals. Yet we still don't know how these electrical signals get transformed into the image you see, into the feeling you feel, into the qualia. Qualia is the actual human conscious subjective experience. The smell, the brightness, the taste, the pain is all qualia, because you as a person feel it consciously. If we were to look at quote-unquote objective reality, we would only see electrical signals going from the nervous system to the brain and back to the body to respond to the signal. So if we want to know how we see color, then we still need to conduct research and explore the nature of qualia, because so far, this is the best understanding we have of biology. But what about the physics? I'm sure we all know this. We were all told that color is just electromagnetic radiation of differing wavelengths. Our three colored cone types let us see electromagnetic radiation, or light with wavelengths from about 400 to 700 nanometers, called the visible light spectrum, from purple to red. And we were all told that color is the material that we are looking at absorbing these wavelengths, but reflecting these ones. A red cube would absorb all light except for the red wavelengths and would reflect those back into our eye, caught by our cones and made into the color red. But now really, how does this work? What determines that this atom will reflect red light but this one won't? And how does anything reflect light at all? Atoms are absolutely tiny, about 0.1 nanometers big. So how would a wavelength of 700 nanometers interact with something that's 7,000 times smaller? How can we see anything when light is too big to interact with atoms? Well, honestly, this is not that complicated. All electromagnetic radiation is just energy, because of this equation. This equation says that the energy of a photon is directly dependent on the frequency of the photon. Photons are the particles of light, by the way, in case you didn't know. So here F would be in hertz, which is cycles per second, or how many times the wave goes up and down in 1 second. So the higher the frequency, the higher the energy would be, meaning purple would have a higher energy than red, because it has a shorter wavelength. By the way, these are the real numbers, and 7.5 is larger than 4.3, in case anyone didn't know. Anyway, so how does a material determine to absorb this energy, but not this? Imagine it like this. We have some atom or structure. Now light shines on this. Light has energy, so the electrons in the atom absorb that energy and get bumped into a higher energy state. But everything wants to be at the lowest energy state possible, so the electron wants to stop being in such a high energy state and emits a photon to get back down to its low energy state. This electron being able to move around in between these energy states is called delocalization. But what determines the color? Well, let's take a structure like beta carotene, for example, which is the compound responsible for making carrots orange. Structures have bonds holding the atoms together, and electrons can be bond electrons or anti-bond electrons. Bond electrons are electrons that hang around in between the bonded atoms and make the bond more stable. Anti-bonded electrons don't hang around between these two atoms and make the bond more unstable. But the bonded electrons are at a lower energy state, and that's why bonded structures are more stable than atoms by themselves. For every bond, we also have an antibond, and every bond/antibond has a different energy level. The more delocalization, the less energy we need to get an electron from a bonded place to an antibond. You can imagine it as a graph like this. If an electron from a low energy bonded position was moved to an antibond, it would need a lot of energy. But if we have a lot of bonds, we also have a lot of antibonds with all different energy levels. So if we now take, for example, this electron, which is bonded at a high energy level, and this antibond, which is at a quite low energy level, yet still higher than all bonds, then moving this electron into this antibond wouldn't be that hard and would not take a lot of energy. This is called the HOMO-LUMO gap. HOMO stands for highest occupied molecular orbital, and LUMO stands for lowest unoccupied molecular orbital. Molecular orbitals are just where electrons are, so their quote-unquote position. Also, I think that the name is self-explanatory. HOMO is the highest energy state that an electron is in, and LUMO is the lowest energy state that an electron could be in. The gap in between these two is the energy that will be absorbed to bump an electron from the HOMO to the LUMO state. Beta carotene has a lot of bonds, so of course also a lot of antibonds and delocalization. Now, as I said earlier, the higher the energy of a photon, the smaller the wavelength. But here, to move an electron, we don't need a lot of energy. So we could shoot a photon at this with a relatively low energy, and it would absorb the photon and still dislodge the electron. But what color would the light that's being reflected by the beta carotene have? Well, the energy at which this electron gets into a higher energy anti-bonding state would be equal to a photon with a wavelength of 470 nanometers. So it absorbs light with a wavelength around 400 to 500 nanometers, meaning it reflects all other visible light. If we mix all of the wavelengths remaining together that don't get absorbed by the beta carotene, we would get the color of said carotene. But light mixes differently from paint and whatever, but there's a simple way of figuring out which color the light being reflected would have. This is the visible spectrum, and this is the visible spectrum rolled up in a circle. Now, beta carotene absorbs colors at 400 to 500 nanometers, and most strongly at 470. Here 400 to 500 white, strongest, that is 470, in red. If we look where that is, and look across the horizon to the opposite side of the circle, we get an estimation of what the color of the beta carotene will be, and we find out that it is orange. And this is color. We were all taught an extremely oversimplified version by our teachers, but this is what really, described by physics and chemistry, color is. So yeah, if an atom or structure absorbs this color, just look to the opposite side of the circle and you'll find the color that the material will reflect. But I've explained this with structures, with bonds. What about something that doesn't have bonds? What about atoms themselves? Gold has a beautiful shiny golden color. But how does it get that color? What electron is changing energy states here? It's just an atom with no bonding anti-bonding states. Well, atoms have shells in which these electrons are. If an electron gains energy, it would swap to a higher energy shell. That's why shells even exist, because the electrons go in order of the next lowest energy state shell. So in gold, an electron would swap from the 5d to the 6s subshell, at the energy cost of a photon with a wavelength of 520 to 450 nanometers. This comes out to this color, and if we look across the circle, boom. But wait, what about pink? On the visible color spectrum, it is nowhere to be found, but on the circle it is. It's the transition from purple to red, which is at two completely different sides of the spectrum. And when we look to the other side, we see green, which is such a common color. So how does chlorophyll, the structure responsible for making plants green, absorb pink light? Well, pink doesn't exist, so that means it must absorb blue light, then stop absorbing green light, then absorb red light again. Well, this is what happens. Let's first look at how chlorophyll works. In the cells of plants and algae, there are organelles, which is kind of like cells, but inside of cells. Sort of like we have organs, these are cells as quote-unquote organs running them, like for example chloroplasts, which is one of these organelles. These chloroplasts have chlorophyll inside of them, and via photosynthesis, these chloroplasts turn the energy of blue and red light waves into useful energy for the plant, such as sugars, whilst at the same time releasing oxygen. And when we look at the graph of absorbance, we find that this is true. It somehow skips over green light. While it still absorbs some of it, it is way less than blue and red. So, how? Well, here we come to the point where asking questions breaks down, because asking why from any point beyond this is useless. We know that the ring of chlorophyll absorbs mostly blue light, and the magnesium ion in the center mostly absorbs red light. Green light just doesn't get absorbed that much, but asking why the ring absorbs this light or why the magnesium ion absorbs this light is useless, because that's just the structure it has and the effect light has on it or it has on light. The mechanism is that the HOMO-LUMO gap absorbs some wavelength, and the mix of wavelengths that get reflected are the color that the material has. There's no point in asking why the HOMO-LUMO gap absorbs this energy. It just does. Last but least, the sun, or just in general anything emitting light. You see, have you ever wondered what color the sun is? I'm sure if you went a bit further than wondering and tried researching it, you'd have found a bunch of different answers. Orange, white, blue, red, colorless, whatever. So, what color really is the sun? First, let's understand what is the sun. The sun is a huge large amount of gases, mostly hydrogen and helium. The sun has so much mass that it has an immense gravity pushing into the core of the sun, meaning there's a huge amount of pressure in the core. Because of this, there are many atoms and particles tightly packed together in the center, and they're pushing out against gravity because they don't want to be crammed together so tightly. In the core, it is so hot because of all the cramming and collisions, and there's so much pressure because there's the whole weight of the sun, that fusion occurs. This is hydrogen atoms fuse together forming helium atoms, which releases a ton of energy. This energy is what keeps the sun quote-unquote burning, and is the energy and light that gets to us. So this is what the sun does, but we don't care about that. We care about the color. So what happens is, through these fusion reactions, photons get emitted and sent to Earth. But let's be honest, no need to take a scientific look at this. A toddler could figure it out. Color is a property of a material which happens after light gets reflected from it. No light gets reflected from the sun and then gets to us because the sun emits light. It emits white light. So what color is the sun? Well, it's white, but really it doesn't have one. But what would you see if you were to look at the sun from space, for example? Well, the sun would be a bright white light, because the sun emits white light, and that's all you'd see. If anyone comes up to you in the street and asks you what color is, you can now answer, I have no clue, because you'd have already forgotten what I said in this video. Bye bye.